This is Dennis Raimondi with the Coffee League, found at thecoffeeleague.com. We discuss all areas of coffee for the coffee nerd, for the person just learning about coffee. And fortunately, today I got a very interesting guest. His name is Charlie Habegger, and he is, or is it pronounced Habegger?
It's Habegger, like hamburger
Habegger.
without the
Okay,
M.
so we'll
Yeah,
get that right. And he's a green coffee buyer at Blue Bottle. And before we start, I should say, I travel around a lot. I think people know that, and I visit tons of places. I'm a big fan of Blue Bottle, and I know they're going through a period of great expansion. Nestle's just bought 68%, I think, of the company and injected a lot of money into them. But I just went to their two new cafes in Miami. One was down in the Art District, and the quality is completely there. I was deeply impressed. Bought some beans, great baristas, very consistently maintaining quality. So, and a lot of that has to do with the person that buys the green beans. So, thank you so very much for taking the time to come on today.
totally my pleasure.
So, a little bit about you, Charlie. I was reading that you in school in Boston College, and then went to graduate school, I think, in Chicago, and at some point went to work for Intelligentsia. Give us a little bit of a background on your what led you to coffee.
Well, I moved to Chicago sight unseen after living in Europe for about a year. And at that point, I had absorbed a lot of espresso culture just traveling throughout Europe. And it was, what we say about traditional European coffee houses is that they are cultural experiences, but not necessarily culinary experiences when it comes to the coffee. But I was fascinated by the equipment, and in University of Chicago, I was studying anthropology.
But
And
what year was this about? What when you were in
this
Europe?
2005.
Okay.
So really at the time, companies, and I'm originally from the Bay Area, and companies like Ritual Roasters in San Francisco were just getting started and, sort of pushing the envelope for very light roasted coffee, very high acid forward coffees with high expression. And it got a lot of people talking about sort of the potential of coffee and certainly the potential of acidity and sort of the roaster as a flavor driver in the marketplace. So, that was going on at home. I was living in Europe, comparing notes and not really feeling that progressive by my coffee surroundings. But I moved to Chicago and had no plans to work in the coffee industry, had plans to be an academic. And what happened after I finished my thesis for my master's was that I wound up living down the street from the flagship Intelligentsia coffee location on Broadway in Chicago. So this was now the middle of 2008, and the downturn in the economy was really severe for the city of Chicago because it's, mainly a corporate city, and it has a strong service industry, and both sectors were pretty heavily rocked by the economic downturn. I was having a difficult time both finding work as a kind of mid-level academic and also having a hard time deciding whether or not I wanted to continue my studies. And so, but what I did know was that I wanted to learn how to use an espresso machine, and I wanted to have a crack at being educated by who at the time, and this is Intelligentsia, had the reputation of being the best coffee education available in the United States.
Right. And what machines were they using in Europe at that time? Was one machine dominant, or was it a variety?
Oh, it was a huge variety.
Hmm.
And a lot of what I got living in Eastern France in a small town were big sort of name brand Italian coffee companies that had like plug and play
Right.
espresso service programs. So like Segafredo, Ely, Lavazza were in a lot of places, heavily commodified products, executed pretty well, from obviously like from my experience in scalability and from understanding coffee as complicated as it is truly a feat of science to be able to scale a product as volatile as coffee into something as consistent as these companies do. But from a culinary standpoint, that I thought was, at the time, I think we certainly thought of progressive coffee houses as being something uniquely American and Northern European, but certainly not in the mainland.
Hmm. Yeah, because I was going to say, I would think at that time in Scandinavia they were being more progressive, still are, and Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, maybe. Well, actually, Southern Europe being a little slower to progress like that. Okay, so then you went to Intelligentsia, and when you went in, were you thinking, okay, I'm going to be a barista, or when did it come to? When did you decide that you're going to go in the direction of actually being a buyer and sourcing?
Well, I went to Intelligentsia for an education, and I knew that the pecking order at the company began with washing dishes, and that's where I started.
Hmm.
And at that time, the training program for baristas was anywhere from 6 months to a year. It was a matter of getting the basics and then practicing to the point where you could prove your competencies to your local trainer. And for some baristas, that took 6 months to get their education component down, and then another 6 months of, say, latte art practice or practice pulling espresso shots one after the other as fast as they possibly could while avoiding the minimum waste levels and,
Hmm.
not pulling a bad shot. And, but what kept me at the company after just sort of integrating into the cafe and falling in love with the cafe life was the education that was available to me. The coffee buyer for Intelligentsia, who I still have a great relationship with, I'm happy to say, is an excellent writer. And he was one of these early pioneers for United States coffee roasters that looked directly to coffee producers for sustainable relationships, but also to drive the culinary experience of the coffee. So a lot of the experience of the coffee for our customers at that time was attributable back to the producers who were responsible for those coffees. And that message was the center of the business model, really, at Intelligentsia. And it was the momentum of the brand. It was the way we talked about coffee at retail. So, everything we did, all the decisions that we made about coffee extraction and what brew methods we were going to use and how coffees went onto the menu and what time of year we had certain coffees, all of that was really producer driven. And of course, it was diffused somewhat by the time it got to the coffee bar, but the education was there. And, so Jeff was this, constant traveler and this prolific writer, and he did an amazing job of making the coffee producer's worldview, approachable to people like me who maybe had an academic background, was really interested in consumerist behavior, really interested in the way that economies worked and why people made the decisions that they made to spend their money on the things that they valued, and was really interested in these value systems. And, I found this coffee value system, something that was previously completely opaque. It was totally relatable to me. And that, I think, during that first year was when I realized that it could be a career, working in this value system and being a part of this argument that takes something that, like coffee, that most people take for granted, unpacking that in front of them and letting them see that it's actually so much more complicated than they thought.
Right, right. Then when did you start as a green coffee buyer at some point at Blue Bottle, or did that come later? And how did you go from Intelligentsia, and then how did you go from Intelligentsia out to California and Blue Bottle?
I worked my way through Intelligentsia, starting as a dishwasher, through barista educator, and then cupper. And a lot of these were simultaneous.
Right.
I at one point was doing 3 of these things at once,
Right.
but was a cupper. And then my last year with the company was spent as a coffee buyer, but I was on a committee with about 8 other people who all had different roles throughout the company, as I did, but we were all contributing to coffee buying as a whole. So everybody sort of had their own country where they were, checking in with older relationships with Intelligentsia. We were all tasting and making decisions together. We were traveling and then writing reports. And I really just had one cycle of that before I moved to Los Angeles to work with Handsome Coffee Roasters, which had been started by 3 former Intelligentsia alumni.
Now, my understanding is that now you travel about 10 months a year, visiting farms, going to where the coffee is sourced. Were you traveling a lot back then? Right? And what was that like for you when you first had the experience of going to a farm and experiencing it from that end? Was that like, hey man, this is what I want to do from now, from henceforth, or tell us about that transition?
Sure. With Intelligentsia, it was sporadic trips. My first trip with the company was in 2010, and it was part of what they call the Extraordinary Coffee Workshop, which at this point is a really large annual production. It's kind of a cross-pollination workshop where coffee producers from all over the world are invited to one producing location, or in some years they've had it in Los Angeles or Chicago, and kind of share notes. And so I went to El Salvador with the company in 2010 as kind of support. I was a barista trainer at the time, so we were bringing coffee samples down with us to El Salvador from different producers all over the world in order to share those terroirs and processing methods with all of the producers who were joining in the conference. So it was a lot of sensory work, and all this was quality driven. And the idea was, if you take some really great coffee producers from one country and put them in a room with some really great coffee producers from another country, their ideas are just going to get better, and that's better for the whole value chain. And my experience with Intelligentsia was very much that quality was community driven, and reiterated to me how pervasive it was in the company. Everyone was focused on what these coffees were and who produced them and why we're celebrating them. My experience since then has been, I think a little bit more isolating, only in the sense that, when I was working for Handsome Coffee Roasters in Los Angeles, and for the last 4 years that I've been with Blue Bottle, the ratio of people with direct experience in coffee value chains versus the people in the company who are focused on operations, executing service in the cafes, things like that, that are definitely part of the value chain, but they're not part of the coffee producer side of the value chain. The ratio of those of us working on the origin side and those of us working on the consuming side is much, much different. For example, now I'm the sole buyer at Blue Bottle, and by the end of this year, we should pass 1,000 employees. So that's a very small ratio.
Mm-hmm. Now,
so
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that it puts an educational burden on my role as well. So it's not just procurement, and it's not just finding win-win partnerships, but it's also, bringing people's stories home and helping Blue Bottle understand why these coffees are not just important to us, but important to the world, and why the prices we pay, the decisions we make, the time of year that we're focusing on certain parts of the world, why it has a big impact, and has the potential to set a really big example.
Right. Now, at what point in your coffee career did you personally begin to appreciate single origin? Is that something that came when you were in Europe, or is that something that did your taste evolve as you came back to the U.S.?
I don't know. It's sort of hard to pull that apart. I don't really know if it was something I learned to do or something that I kind of discovered. I do remember making a coffee before I started working at Intelligentsia. I was working at another cafe on the south side of Chicago when I was in school there, and it was this pot of coffee that we made in a French press at a friend's house. And I remember tasting it, and I just had this sudden realization that what I was drinking was alive, which is very strange to say. But of course, I use that language all the time now. We talk about the life of the coffee, the potential of the coffee, the genetics. But it was kind of before I really knew how alive green coffee really was. And before I had the privilege of tasting a coffee from immediately after it was dried at the farm, all the way through export to import to the roastery 6 months down the line after we had sort of mastered it and been working with it for multiple months. I hadn't had that experience where I'm checking in with the life cycle of a coffee from the producer all the way to the consumer. It was just a snapshot, which is what any single cup of coffee ever is. But I had this realization that what I was drinking was alive and was worth pursuit as a result, and I think the drive to understand why I felt that way was just as powerful as anything, because I didn't really know at the time that the education was available. I just knew that the coffee was compelling to me.
Now, my understanding is growing single origin coffee, going to the farmer, benefits the farmer. Is that the case? And if so, How is it the case?
I think I would substitute, instead of saying single origin, I might submit that that's true if what you're talking about is high quality coffee.
All right, let's assume it's high quality. Yeah.
Okay, Blue Bottle is a company that blends coffee, and we sell coffee on their own as single origins.
Mm-hmm.
And the basic idea of a single origin is that you experience the value chain and you find a way to draw a box or draw a frame around a particular isolated aspect of coffee in general, whether it's a single variety from a particular place. To some people, it's a single region, which could involve hundreds or thousands of farmers,
Mm-hmm.
but perhaps all their coffee was picked and processed on the same day, so you have a day lot, and that is compelling. It's really like, if, making a photograph, for example, is just putting a frame around, the motion that you want to capture, and then that becomes
Mm-hmm.
your image. It's like if a single origin is really just a single snapshot of what is like a very complex and constantly moving state of coffee production around the world.
I'm going to ask, how does Blue Bottle define single origin, and might it be different than how other coffee companies define single origin?
Well, a few different ways. And I think every company probably has multiple ways that they
Mm-hmm.
do this. For us, my goal with Blue Bottle's program is to bring the best, most exemplary versions of every coffee in the world
Mm-hmm.
to our guests. And what that means is, that we're working with a lot of different production systems. We're working, we aren't working, but of course we're visiting and supplying ourselves from producers all over the world who live in, very unique places with very unique histories and economies. And the goal is to eventually understand what those economies are like and what the quality potential is like, so that we can extract something from there that allows us to showcase an example of a really great producer from a really particular time and place, because we think that's compelling, and that adds something to our guests' understanding over time of what coffee is in general, right? Which is this big dynamic topic.
Mm-hmm.
With all this potential for deliciousness. But those are different things. So in the case of like Myanmar, for example, a single origin to us could be a host of different coffees that we are putting together from different communities. And in some cases, we might purchase coffee from 5 different producing communities that are within 1 hour's drive from each other. And because of what they produce is such a small volume, we're making a blend of all 5 producing communities. We're giving the blend a new name and marketing it on behalf of that general region and the work that they've done to improve their quality. And in the meantime, there's one particular community that to us on the cupping table had a very compelling taste profile that was just a bit brighter, a bit more expressive, a bit more aromatic than all the rest of the communities which we combined. So we then isolated that single community. So in our portfolio from this one particular region in Myanmar, we have the general blend of 5 communities, and then we have an isolated single community that we're marketing on its own as kind of an outlier coffee. Mm-hmm. And so in that case, both of those coffees are single origin coffees. But of course, our hand as the buying company has definitely influenced the volume available, the way that it's consolidated, and we are making different value propositions with 2 different coffees that are very close to one another.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you go, you go ahead.
Well, the same thing might happen in another part of the world, but just according to different guidelines. It could be neighboring farms, mm-hmm. could be different processing methods from the same farm. It's really anything that we think makes a compelling addition, to the coffees of the world.
Now when you go, you're on a trip to buy, and you're tasting different coffees from a region or whatever. Is there, and I assume you're not always doing it by yourself, and there are other people with you. Is there usually general consensus about what is preferred and what you should be buying, or is there often a lot of discussion and disagreement in regard to what is the best quality, what is the most reflective of what you want from a particular region?
That's a really good question. Here's what I find is, if you were to imagine quality in coffee as a triangle, and the bottom part of the triangle, which is the widest, imagine that's the lowest, most generic quality, right?
Mm-hmm.
And at that level, most coffees of the world taste very similar to one another because they're sort of low in expressiveness. Maybe they're, have sort of medium levels of cleanliness. And in general, they're not expressing, very sort of sharp, genetic expression that comes from really high elevation growth or very expert processing, whatever you might think. As you increase in quality, there's less and less of that coffee available. And furthermore, what we find is that as you increase in quality, you increase the personality of the coffee as well.
Mm-hmm.
In general, tasters of coffee will agree up to about 85 on our quality system.
Mm-hmm.
And 85, just for the context of your listeners, is considered a perfectly exemplary coffee. Most people would drink that and identify it as being delicious.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's going to be sweet, clean, consistent, and have some sense of character to it, right? Some particular thing
Mm-hmm.
you can probably point to and say, oh, that's unique. As you break the score of 85 and continue going up in quality, what you find is that coffee becomes much more personal because the profiles become more intense and more unique. And so you might have coffees that, to some cuppers are 89, 90 points because their acidity is really complex and unique. And then other cuppers might find that coffee to be too sour. So their scores are still, capped at 85 or 86 points.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess what I'm saying is it's pretty easy at the very high end of the spectrum for people to feel personal about their coffee purchasing decisions and to feel like the decision that they're making to purchase the coffee is perfectly right for them and perfectly right for their company. And this is a good justifier for higher prices at the higher quality points in coffee, because those qualities are oftentimes personally valuable to certain roasters more than they might be to like an importer, for example, who is typically buying for the generic market and wouldn't want to take a chance on a very radical profile
Mm-hmm.
if they don't know that they can sell it. So as a result, you see producers with really unique offerings that have really, say, boutique styles of fermentation for their coffee, or they're doing very unique day lots or growing very unique varieties to the world. With this particular selection, they're typically marketing these coffees directly to roasters because they want to find that roaster who has a sensory connection with what they're producing. Because if you make that match as a producer, then that can be very, not just lucrative for you, but it can also add a lot of, marketing potential to your operation. It's very validating for you, and you can have long-term, buyer stability if people really love your touch on
Mm-hmm.
coffee, So I've traveled with a lot of people, and I often encounter other buyers. You always do, especially in peak harvest when there's the most coffees to taste before they've exported, especially in a region like East Africa, where a lot of the coffees are bought and sold either at auction systems or they're consolidated by exporters. So a lot of buyers are going to the same place to kind of screen the same coffees or shop
Mm-hmm.
for the same coffees. And we always compare notes, Being in the field with other buyers is a really freeing experience because we're all kind of, working our stuff out. We all have our different objectives and our different personalities, but we definitely compare notes.
Mm-hmm.
And, just to give an example, in February of this year, I was in Kenya, and I had one day of a few days in the export office where there was only one other coffee buyer in the office, and it was George Howell of George Howell fame. He kind of needs no introduction in specialty coffee. And, George has experience that by anyone's standards is commendable, is probably going to be difficult for any coffee professional to replicate in their particular career. Very few people have, the respect for their dedication to quality and their dedication to traceability that George Howell has. And the two of us were able to just sort of taste coffees, and he was just as open with his notes as I was with mine. So we would taste the table together, and we kind of look up at the same time to ask each other, hey, what do you think of your coffees? Hey, do you mind if I taste? Hey, do you mind coming around here, letting me know what you think of this one? And in the end of the day, we were discussing splitting lots of coffee together because we both were gravitating towards the same ones. Of course, there were other coffees that we like completely differently from one another, but we also were, speaking as equals. And because we were outside of our businesses, we're both there, and we both believe ultimately that we're doing this work on behalf of the producers and on behalf of our customers, because we want both of them. We want the producers to succeed in their life, and be validated for the work they're putting in and the potential that they bring to the world. And we want our customers to appreciate this,
Mm-hmm.
So we're not necessarily competing in that way.
Right. Now, Blue Bottle has gotten a big influx of capital, and I think some people, when they hear that, Blue Bottle 68% was sold to Nestle's, know, hey, are they going to maintain their quality? As a buyer, how has it affected you, the growth and financial stability and strength of the company getting much stronger? Has there been? Is there a downside, or is it all an upside to that?
I've been looking for a downside, and so far I haven't found one.
Okay, give us the upside then.
Sure. The upside, I think any coffee buyer would agree that to be in a position to go back to coffee producers that you really admire, needing more from them and bringing them more business is the greatest feeling in the world, because a buyer, I think the best way to think about my role is that I'm in a position of selling coffee to my company. And I think most buyers, if they thought about it, would agree that that's the best way to look at their positions, whereby, I'm out in the coffee producing world. I'm scouting, I'm doing research, I'm asking a lot of questions, I'm investigating value chains, and I have my own personal relationships, which are getting deeper every year. And when I come back to my company, physically or, in these transactions, when I'm working with Blue Bottle on the coffees that we've already purchased, or once a coffee has arrived and we need to approve it for production, those are positions where I'm really the advocate, and in a way, it's in Blue Bottle's best interest to be as strict as possible on quality. So I'm sort of helping the company set the quality standard, but then I'm also trying to, bring coffees in that I think are compelling from compelling producers or terroirs in the world. And I'm in a position of advocacy, having the growth it's great for me because it gives me more leverage in the field, certainly, because, if I find a cooperative that I think is exemplary, and if the quality is according to our standard, and if we think that it's excellent, then what that means is that I now have a lot of potential to go in and make a really big difference for a producing operation, for an exporter. We are, because we're a retail focused company and we don't have wholesale distribution of our coffee, it means that we control the final cup quality down to the individual 22 or 23 grams of coffee at a time. That is the best argument in the world for buying the best qualities that you can find, because only the best coffees in the world will not have some variability on a 22 gram basis. But if you're serving coffee by the cup, then that's the easiest justification for buying the best coffee you can find, because if your coffee's inconsistent, or if it's unclean, or if it's not compelling, in flavor, then people are really going to start to notice. And that's not something that you can hide if you are selling coffee one cup at a time. And those cups of coffee that we're selling, those are the margins for us. That's what's helping us open stores, pay for health insurance for our baristas. The quality is what is driving our business, and we want to be a great business.
Right. And let me ask, there's been an incredible growth of specialty coffee in the United States and many parts of the world now. Do you think that is quality driven, that primarily the quality of coffee is much better and people are becoming more sophisticated and recognizing that? not unlike the growth of wine in the last 50 years, or craft beer in the last 7 or 8, 10 years. You think that it's really quality that's driving the growth?
I think in some segments, yeah, I do. I think that it's easier now than it has been so far in my 10 years of coffee to convince people that good coffee is worth paying more money for. I think now, in my observation, it's universal. More people understand that there is such a thing as great coffee. They understand that there is such a thing as a very rare coffee that some people are going to find is totally worth paying more money for.
Mm-hmm.
That used to be the case in wine. It used to be the case in like Scotch, for example, but it wasn't in coffee. And it wasn't until a couple groundbreaking coffees or coffee, roasters and their marketing campaigns were doing this, at least in the United States. It wasn't until these things happened that people could really accept, even if they weren't participating, they could accept, objectively, yes, there is this market, it exists, and, they're working with the best coffees in the world. So I see that being more acceptable now than it was in the past. There's definitely less radicalism behind marketing coffees for their quality, and there's less radicalism talking about cost of production for coffee producers or specific varieties that are very rare and uniquely expensive because of that. I do think that the biggest shortcoming right now in specialty coffee is that people are not marketing coffees on the basis of their cost to the roaster. That people aren't using price. They're not talking about price enough when they're selling expensive coffees. Most of the time, specialty roasters are marketing coffee only on the basis of its quality. For example, we paid $25 a pound, US per pound of green coffee because this coffee is so delicious. And with that proposition to a customer, eventually you're going to find customers who stop agreeing with you, right? Because it's very personal, these high profile coffees. And also, I think it's very hard for customers to navigate this world where some coffee at some roasters, is $10 a cup, but they might prefer this other coffee that's $3 a cup at another roaster because it's from a different part of the world, or it was roasted differently, or it was served fresher, or I don't know. I think it's a difficult proposition when you're only talking about quality. I think that quality is the thing for roasters that justifies paying a really high price for coffee. But the reason that a coffee is very expensive most of the time is a combination of scarcity and uniqueness and value to that particular roaster. If I were to tell you that we paid $10 per pound for this particular Pacamara variety from this particular country, and it's only because we scored the coffee 89 points, that would be a lie, because the truth is that the producer is naming the price of the coffee and we're paying what the producers ask for. And if we think the producer is undervaluing their coffee, we will add a premium onto that because we think that's a sustainable high price. And we think that it's worth more than that. And we know that our margin can take care of that as a roaster. And so the pricing systems behind some of the most expensive coffees in the world, those are truly driving the price to the roaster. It's not as arbitrary as I think marketing language makes it sound, where we tasted it, we loved it this much, therefore we put this price on the coffee. I think it's much more that, producers are putting products out into the world that are so compelling that roasters are willing to pay whatever they need to pay to get that coffee. Okay. And I think that element of coffee buying is something that is totally underexplored in marketing. So it's something that I want to see roasters talking much more about. It's sort of your willingness to meet the producer, at the standard that they have set, or your willingness to outbid other buyers in this competition format, and that being a driver of quality. It's not as if you went to the farm, thought everything was beautiful, and because the quality was so good, you offered what you offered. And that's not the only reason that you're charging what you're charging at your retail space. The truth is you have a business to run, and if your customers aren't, if they aren't inspired by your business, or if they don't know that your employees are well cared for, or that, you're making positive changes in the world, for example, it's much more difficult to pay a really high price for a cup of coffee because the margin is going to the roaster. Right.
One thing I'm curious about, the people producing the coffee. When you go to the farms and you're getting these very high quality coffees, are the people that are working the farms, the actual farmers, the laborers in the field, are they also coffee consumers? Do they enjoy and appreciate the quality of what they're producing as a consumer?
Sometimes. Some of the, to me, just from a global trade standpoint, some of the world's greatest trade ironies are at place in the coffee lands where, producers or farm labor in some of the most gifted terroirs in Colombia, for example, are drinking Nescafe, which would be a completely different species produced
Right.
on an archipelago in Southeast Asia, processed in Vietnam, and then imported to Colombia. And
Right.
still, at that point, it's still cheaper than them drinking their own coffee, right? And it's either a gap of alienation there because what you're producing isn't the same as what you're consuming, and it couldn't be. And I think that's also a great irony of global trade. But it's also just the price, the fact that it's actually cheaper to buy this processed imported thing than it is to simply consume your own coffee. I do, however, see that changing almost everywhere in the world. One of my favorite examples is in Aceh, which is the northern tip of the island of Sumatra in Indonesia, which is famous for a particular processing style that yields really earthy, typically lower acid, but not all the time, coffees that express certain flavor profiles that you really just can't recreate in other parts of the world. And it's funny because a lot of the flavors of this terroir come from this processing style that's a lot like hot potato, where farmers will sort of pick the fruit, process the fruit as quickly as possible, sell it to a collector. The collector will, drive around collecting half-processed coffee from as many different households as possible, put it all into a pile, dry it out for a little bit more, hull it again, then sell that to another collector, et cetera, et cetera. So you would think that people would be really alienated from what they're producing. But at the same time, if you go and spend time in the highlands there, you see that most people have a little personal tarp of coffee that's out drying on the road in the few hours of sun that they get during the afternoons. And that there are little coffee roasting businesses that are sort of hidden, in particular in Takengon, which is the main city in this region, main like trading posts. There are places where, as a coffee farmer, you can take your personally dried coffee beans back to the roaster in Takengon, and they will roast it for you for a fee, and then you can take it home and drink it. And every single house that I have visited in this region, I'm always served coffee that was produced by that household, and the coffee is always cleaner and more expressive than most of the coffee samples that are sent to me by exporters in the same region. And it's one of my favorite sort of hidden gems in the coffee world, is just how much people love and appreciate their own product in that area. And you can go nowadays, and this is it's a very conservative Muslim corner of Indonesia as well. So typically, you don't find alcohol in the restaurants. You typically don't see, mixed gender couples on the street together after a certain time of night. The coffee houses are really where people spend their social time. And more you see local roasters and young people who are my age or in their 20s, and they're serving, home processed lots of coffee that they did at their friend's house or their families did down the street or something. And they're now roasting it and selling it in the cafes simply because they prefer it. There isn't much of a business case because it's not like they're marketing their micro lots or asking exorbitant prices. They're definitely on par with the local cafe culture, which is cheap. But what they're selling is, a product of their region. And in many cases, a product of their own personal family or their own personal friends. And that to me is like that, the trips that I take up there are sometimes my most inspiring, because it's like a glimpse into this world where to really get the best, you have to go to where it's produced. And in coffee, that's never been the case.
That's a great story. One last question for you, Charlie, and that is, what coffee did you consume today, and or what coffee will you be consuming today? Your own coffee drinking habits.
Sure. Let's see. Actually, I've had one coffee today, 3 different times, because I have it at home and I brewed it for some guests that came over this morning as well. And it's a coffee from the northern province in Rwanda, from a washing station that is now called Bishoki, but in the past it was called Rulindo, which is the name of the province. And it was just named after the province because it was the first washing station in that area. And then it differentiated later on once more washing stations came into the area. And, actually it was a coffee that about 6 years ago when I was working in Los Angeles, I had bought from an importer under the old name, which was Rulindo. And I love the coffee. It was one of my favorite coffees from Rwanda I'd ever tasted. all like top notes, very floral, chamomile-like,
Mm-hmm.
very elusive in terms of flavors, just extremely delicate. And then it wasn't until about 3 years later that I was in Rwanda for, I'd been working there for about 3 or 4 years at that point, and I found out that the exporter that we've been working with just started working with this washing station in the northern province, not far from Kigali, and it turned out to be the same washing station whose coffee I had purchased from the importer a while back, and it was the first year for the washing station working with that exporter, and so immediately I was like, really? We got to go visit. We got to go see them because I really wanted to meet them. And so we went there, and ever since then, we've been buying the coffee for Blue Bottle under the new name, which is Bushoki.
Mm-hmm.
And every year, it's one of my favorite coffees.
Great, great. Well, thank you so very much for your time. It's been amazingly informative. I could ask you at least 100 more questions, but hopefully we'll have you back on some other time. Thanks a lot, Charlie.
Thanks, Dennis. I'd love to be back.
Right.